Hi, I'm Yusuf Salam. Welcome to the Peace, Love, and Shawarma podcast, where my friends and I discuss possibilities and strategies for a better world where love, peace, and justice reign supreme. Today's guest is my good friend, Mary Davis. Mary was born and raised in the United States and is of Christian Palestinian descent. She served in the U.S. Army and majored in journalism and media production. Her disconnect from her cultural identity piqued her interest to learn more pertaining to her heritage and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. She is the director of the short documentary, Christians of Palestine, Life Behind the Wall. The documentary was filmed in 2016 and released in 2017. Mary is active on social media advocating for the Palestinian cause and maintains hope that the truth will come to light. Links to her documentary, blog, and Instagram can be found in the description of this podcast. We discuss Palestinian history, Palestinian Christians, life in Palestine today, October 7th, 9/11, and much more. You're really going to enjoy this. Welcome, Mary. So good to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, there's just so much going on in the world right now, and I just appreciate you, sister. I appreciate all that you're doing on Facebook, just your life and your background and your love for people and humanity and creation and how that is just beautifully expressed through you and so much through the film you produced, Christians of Palestine, Life Behind the Wall. So let's get into the questioning here, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that works for me. I'm ready.
All right. Okay. So what was your impetus for producing the film Christians of Palestine, Life Behind the Wall?
Well, I think there was a lot of motivation for wanting to produce a documentary, and I think a lot of it stems from multiple experiences throughout my life. My childhood experience of feeling different, not always fitting in, along with that lack of knowledge pertaining to my identity, I think provoked my curiosity
Mm.
in wanting to film this. Also, I think I witnessed specifically 2014, the Gaza onslaught. That's around the time where I kind of reconnected with family on my mother's side. And I found out that my great grandfather was a former mayor of Bethlehem and started learning the history. But also during that Gaza onslaught, I don't know if you recall, it was Amon Mahaldeen, who is now the anchor at NBC News. He's one of the anchors there.
Mm.
He was in Gaza at the time. And he witnessed the 4 Palestinian children being killed by Israeli gunboats. I'm
Mm.
not sure if you remember that one.
No, no.
So he witnessed that. He was tweeting about it. He was active on Twitter. And he said that he had just witnessed the Israeli airstrike on these 4 boys. And I remember the immediate response from our media was to push out, of course, the Israeli response, which was Hamas was using the children as human shields.
Mm.
And so this is the narrative that we see. And they ended up taking him out of Gaza, actually, after that occurred. And I believe there was some complaints. And so then he was eventually placed back in Gaza to continue his reporting.
Mm.
But I think that experience witnessing the 2014 Gaza onslaught, reconnecting with family who were posting at that time on social media. And I was seeing the images coming out of Gaza that were just horrible to see.
Mm-hmm.
But then realizing our media is not telling the truth. I was hearing rockets raining down on Israel, and you hear always about these thousands of rockets, but then you see the death toll, and it's,
Yeah.
Not anyone really from the Israeli side, but thousands from the Palestinian side. So I knew that we were receiving a one-sided perspective on this conflict. And I felt that interviewing Palestinian Christians would potentially reach the American people who are overwhelmingly Christian and could help to make an impact and positive change towards peace. But
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, while I knew little bit about Christian Zionism, I didn't understand just the full scope of this belief and how widespread and influential this belief actually was. And I think I learned that after filming my documentary and looking at the censorship that had taken place before me, like Bob Simon, for instance, who filmed Christians of the Holy Land. It was a 60-minute segment, and that was also censored.
Mm. Now, a lot of people till recent didn't even know that Palestinian Christians existed.
Right.
So
Right.
that's the crazy thing. The Orientalism, to borrow Edward Said's word, the brainwashing of the Western mind through media, through church, through politics, just had a narrative that was horrible towards Arabs, towards Muslims, towards Palestinians. And I can't remember, Mary, I can't remember in the first, 40 years of my life, perhaps, ever hearing of Palestinian Christians. So will you speak to that?
Yeah. So I think part of it is that the Christian community in Palestine, what I witnessed firsthand is
Hmm.
these people are living under oppression, right? But they put on a face of happiness, and absolute, it's incredible, honestly, their spirit. They're
Hmm.
always looking at the positive. And so when you hear from them and you see them and they are speaking about their experience, it might not come across as the worst case scenario or situation. But I believe that's because they have the spirit of God, right?
Hmm.
That's one thing. I also believe, it is this thing called Christian Zionism or American evangelicalism that promotes just a dispensational belief in the end times, and this belief that we need to return the Jews to the Holy Land, to bring on a second coming of Christ. And then also the narrative of history, the historical context of the Muslims came in and killed everybody.
Hmm.
I think there's some historical context that's just not accurate. I mean, there's
Yeah.
churches next to mosques. So this ideology that we did not coexist or live together and we've been fighting for thousands of years is an incorrect narrative. And I think it's a popular narrative. It's a widely believed narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a convenient narrative for those who want the land grab and for those who want to rule that part of the world.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
It is.
definitely. All right. Well, so what is your response to people who believe that modern Israelis are indigenous to the Holy Land and Palestinians were an invented Jew hating group? They came from surrounding Arab countries, and these countries should somehow reabsorb this fake group that calls themselves Palestinians, according to them.
Right. So I would start by saying, regardless of the name you apply to our people, you could say every name is made up, right? Everybody identifies differently. It's normal to want to distinguish yourself or identify yourself separate from your oppressor, from people who are subjugating you, right?
Hmm.
And so I would say, regardless of the name that you apply, there were Muslims, Christians, and Jewish people who were living in Palestine prior to the creation of Israel. There are Palestinian Jews, even today, who used to live there, who oppose the state of Israel, who today will not identify themselves as an Israeli, right? And they're living there in Jerusalem, by the way, because they lived along Muslims and Christians, prior to the state. And, the thing is also I want to mention this because I think this is important. 70% of the people held in captivity in Gaza were originally from parts of Israel, what we consider parts of Israel today. And many people don't understand that. So, yeah, I mean, Palestinian Christians, Muslims, and Jews were living together on the land with no apartheid walls prior to the creation of Israel. And the
Hmm.
Christian population was even much higher than it is today.
Hmm.
And that's something that I think many Americans are not aware of. Now, when it comes to, the belief that Israelis are indigenous to the Holy Land, I do not believe the modern state of Israel, created in 1948, is the same as biblical Israel. However, we can draw comparisons because there are groups of people who are taught to believe they are of the ancient Hebrews and they're returning to their land. And therefore, they have a strong belief that they are justified in their oppression of others and they're unwilling to recognize their participation in that oppression, or that it's morally unethical, even.
Hmm.
My thing is, there's been conversion between faith groups throughout centuries, along with intermarriage. I mean, I'm just going to use an example for us today. Jared Kushner, he's Jewish American. He's been former President Trump's son in law, married to his daughter, Ivanka Trump. His family origins are traced back to Belarus. He has no ancestral connection to Palestine or the region of the Levant, but he and his wife, Ivanka Trump, who's also a convert to Judaism, they can
Yeah.
move to a settlement in the West Bank today and travel freely to Jerusalem. While we have Palestinians in the West Bank, many who were born in Jerusalem have family residing in East Jerusalem, and they would need a permit to enter. And permits are often denied, which is mentioned in my documentary, by the way. So, this is a part of Israel's right of return law. Anyone who is Jewish, doesn't matter your background, right?
Hmm.
If you're Jewish, you can return to the land of Israel because they believe that these people were kicked out of their homeland 2,000 years ago, even though many of them are converts. Like I said, Ivanka Trump is a convert.
Hmm.
Jared Kushner, his ancestry comes from Belarus, but they have a right to return. While
Hmm.
Palestinians who lost their land and home 75 years ago do not have the right to return to their homeland. And I believe this ideology is racist.
Yeah. So it's kind of like a Nigerian converting to Roman Catholicism and believing that he has a right to live in Italy and to kick, kick an Italian out of their home at gunpoint with the government's help and the military and just take over because he swapped religions, where he's not Italian, obviously.
Right. Right.
It's crazy. It's so ludicrous. And when you look at how this thing is so convoluted, I mean, it's nuts. Where you have people that can, you can trace them back thousands of years, have lived there, and you've got people since the time of Jesus that have lived there in Palestine, many Jews who converted to Christianity or converted to Islam, who can trace their roots to Jews that were there before the time of Jesus. I mean, this is just wild, and they've survived so many empires, even since the Roman Empire, and to say that they have no right to the land is really nuts. And Ivanka Trump does, and Jared Kushner does, and all of these people who cannot trace their genealogy back to Levant, but it's really Eastern Europe, Russia, and other places, and New York City, Ivanka Trump. I mean, it is absolutely nuts. Again, it's like the Nigerian guy converting to Roman Catholicism and believing that he has rights, that he somehow magically becomes indigenous to Italy and can do whatever, take a get him an apartment in the Vatican. It's nuts.
It really doesn't make sense. And then if you really think about it, some Jewish communities believe differently than others. So in some communities, they believe that you can convert, while others you cannot.
Hmm.
But we'll continue with Ivanka Trump for now, because this is
Hmm.
great for my next example. So she wasn't Jewish by birth. She converted to Judaism. Well, some Jews believe that if your mother is not born a Jew, then when she has children, they're not Jewish.
Hmm.
Right? So under that belief, her children aren't really Jewish because she wasn't Jewish. She wasn't born Jewish. So it's very odd. Too many different beliefs and contradictions within their belief system to accept that Judaism is a racial identity. And it's so interesting because this belief that's being kind of taught is really a Nazi agenda about all Jews being of one racial group. And it seems
Hmm.
like the Zionist Jews have accepted this as the fact and that they are indeed a racial group. So this is interesting because I mean, there are Jewish people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, like you had just explained. You can be from anywhere
Hmm.
and be Jewish. So, and it's just like Christianity and Islam. It's the same. You can convert between faith groups. But this idea that this particular religion is tied to an ethnic identity, it just kind of
Hmm.
doesn't make sense. It's
Yeah.
illogical, really.
And the individuals automatically belong there and should take the place of people who can trace their genealogy back to the original Hebrew. It is absolutely nuts. And then you got people who, again, they can't trace their genealogy back, but through religion and all kind of crazy claims,
Right.
they're in the land. And then people, these John Hagee and all these Zionist Christians in the United States Like, oh, these people are, they're descendants of,
It's
of
insane.
ancient Israel. And when you look at all the genealogical records being destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans when the temple was destroyed, it's crazy to think, you cannot trace back. You can't find a Levitical priest, a legitimate one. I don't believe in a third temple, all that junk. It's so antichrist. But this whole, well, Christian Zionism is an oxymoron, but that whole agenda, that whole political ideology that is backed up by really bad religion and science and history is really, the more you learn about it, I mean, the more it's just this. There's so many little blocks in the Jenga stack that have already been removed. I mean, the thing was a house of cards to begin with. It really was, and yeah, we could really get into that more. But do you have anything else to speak to that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, when you talk about bad religion or theology, I mean, I would like, Christians who identify as like Christian Zionists to really read into John chapter 8, where Christ went to the Mount of Olives.
Mhm.
And he's saying to the Jews, he's saying to them, he says, you may be of Abraham's seed, but you're not doing the deeds of Abraham.
Mhm.
So you're not doing the deeds of Abraham. You're of your father, the devil. I mean, he takes it even farther and says, you are of your father, the devil. He lies, he kills, all of these things. And
Mhm.
it's very clear throughout the Bible and throughout the New Testament. There's no Jew or Gentile. We're all one within Christ. So, this
Yeah.
ideology of returning Jews to the land, when Christ was saying, you're not of Abraham's seed because you're not doing the deeds of Abraham, like they've
Mhm.
made this ideology about race and ethnic identity, and that
Yeah.
provides an automatic salvation. And there's no need to have good deeds,
Yeah.
to do good in the world. And this,
Yeah.
I believe, is what Christ preached against. I mean, that's what he
Yeah.
was preaching against at the Mount of the Olives. When you read
Yeah.
chapter 8, he was preaching against this ideology. And I believe that Christian Zionism, this is my belief, that they're preaching an antichrist, almost racist ideology that promotes never ending violence, death, and destruction. And
It
that's not
is.
my Christianity.
No.
Right. And then also, if you read the Old Testament, it talks about the Israelites, the ancient Israelites mixing with other groups. So,
Yeah.
this ideology of a pure bloodline is just, like I said, illogical.
Oh, it is. You look at Solomon's wives, even look at Joseph. Moses married a Cushite, most likely an Ethiopian woman. And if anyone who's ever been to Ethiopia, I can't blame them for that one. They're beautiful. but but no, there is no mix. And it's usually and they usually end up turning white in the comic books and in the Sunday school material as well. Yeah.
Right, right.
So it's absolutely crazy. It is nuts.
Mhm.
And yeah, thank you for bringing that out, the whole Zionist agenda, where, man, oh, it is such an affront to the person of Jesus Christ and his finished work. When you're trying to build up the middle wall that he tore down, Jesus is the consummate fulfillment of Israel. Old covenant Israel was a vehicle, not a destination, to bring us Jesus,
Right,
who is Abraham's seed, according to Galatians. And we are in him. And if we're Christ, you're Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. This is a universal promise for all nations, for the entire earth, not for just one place. And Jesus said, remember the woman at the well in John chapter 4? This lady's like, well, she had her religious presuppositions. You Jews say in Jerusalem is where we ought to worship, but we say that here in Samaria, in this mountain, is where we ought to worship. And Jesus said, woman, I assure you, okay, let me tell you something. The Father it's not about geography, neither this mountain nor in Jerusalem, okay, where God seeks to be worshiped. That's not it. It transcends that. But the
right,
Father wants to be worshiped in spirit and in truth. This thing, it transcends geography. It transcends, it's not racist at all. It is not territorial. God is not a real estate agent and a warmonger. I mean, that's why the whole ideology is nuts. And
right,
it really places, Moses and the prophets and everybody on the same plane as Jesus, instead of him being Lord. And he's the only one who could lay claim to the truth that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and that he is the brightness of the Father's glory, the express image of his person, who upholds all things by the word of his power. And he's the only one who could say, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Okay. Jesus is God's perfect selfie, and he is the antithesis of so much of what Old Covenant Israel believed about Yahweh. So again, you Christian Zionism is a huge contradiction. It is an oxymoron, and Mary, it's being blown out of the water. It really is.
And it's really obvious now, like
Yeah.
what they believe. For those of us paying attention, I think for us believers that are
Hmm.
paying attention to everything right now, we're recognizing that this is true. Like there are these Christian Zionists and they have power, even though if we say that it's anti-Semitic, I mean, just look at it. Just look
Hmm.
at it. Look at what's happening. And,
Yeah. While we're here, I want you to speak to. There's a part of this question, okay? And I'm going to ask the question again, but there's a part that I want to really touch on. What's your response to people who believe that modern Israelis are indigenous to the Holy Land and Palestinians were an invented Jew-hating group from surrounding Arab countries who should reabsorb them? Now, I heard this way back in the day when I
yeah.
was in my 20s, that there's no such thing as Palestinians, that these were just Jew-hating Arabs. They made up this identity, and they ought to go back to the countries from whence they came.
Yeah, I don't believe that. I believe, if you look into the history and you pay attention to objective historical historians
Yeah,
like Ian Pompey or who else is there? There's a bunch of them.
yeah,
There's definitely even Israelis who speak out, like Miko Peled.
yeah.
He's a general's son who I think his grandfather was a signer on the Israeli Declaration of Independence and whatnot. So he's very
Mhm.
vocal against what Israel is doing.
Yeah.
And they'll tell the truth about the history that, Christians, Muslims, and Jews were living together, were coexisting on that land together before
Mhm.
the creation of Israel. And I think anyone can understand that if you separate people and you divide people
Mhm.
up and you kick people out of their houses and off of their land, that's going to cause some sort of animosity, right?
Yes.
And I don't think people have the full context of the narrative of the history of the Nakba, and that's something that's been in question. I'm hearing it more and more about the Nakba and people bringing it up and denying it, right? But then you have people who are
Mhm.
using it to say a second Nakba is going to happen within the Israeli government. I mean, they're very vocal about wanting to see another Nakba, which to me is ethnic cleansing and genocide. I mean, I think there was killing then, and
Yes.
so it's unbelievable what we're
Yes.
witnessing today.
And there are pictures, there's legal documentation, there are coins, and where this really came, you talk about Elon Pape, where this really came to the forefront is when these known as the new Israeli historians, when they got hold of the actual government archives and
Mhm.
saw I mean, just Israelis had documented their own crimes and the
Yep,
history, and these things are in detail. When they got hold of those things, they were like, whoa, what has happened? And then when you again you bring together the Palestinian story, and again, I've got a coin right here sitting about 5 feet from me that is older than the state of Israel. That's a Palestinian coin.
right, right.
I mean, it is nuts. It really
Palestine didn't
is.
exist. We didn't have a kingdom. We didn't have a leader. We didn't have a president. I mean, this is the common rhetoric I hear from Zionists online
Hmm.
who want to discredit Palestine existing. But I mean, that's like saying the Native Americans didn't exist, right? It's like
Yeah.
saying the Native Americans didn't exist. They weren't here because a European government wasn't in control of that territory. That's basically what you're saying,
Hmm.
because there wasn't a European leader, which, Benjamin
Yeah.
Netanyahu, his ancestry comes from Europe as well, Poland, I
Yeah.
believe. So,
He's Polish. Yeah.
yeah, his
Mm.
father's last name was Milikowski. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um,
That sounds like we say in Boston. Yeah. Wicked Jewish, huh? Yeah.
and people will say, "Oh, they changed their last name so they can be more connected to their roots." And I don't believe that. I think if you go back, you'll look at the presidents or prime ministers, excuse me, of Israel.
Yeah.
Ben Gurion, for instance, his last name was Grun, which means
Hmm.
green in German.
Yeah.
And you look at these people and they're obviously having, European type features, most of them, not saying some of them, like Ehud Barak. I think
Yeah.
he actually is like Iraqi Jewish or
Mm-hmm.
something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But you have a,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of them who are European Jewish. And I feel like changing of the last names was kind of a way to manipulate history, like in the
Yeah.
future, because they made comments like, the old will die, the young will forget.
Yeah.
We didn't forget. We're here.
Yes.
My father didn't teach me a lot about my identity, and I still researched and I connected with my people, and I continue to learn and grow. I don't think this movement is dying anytime soon.
No, no.
Yeah, we
And you're not
know.
going to change your name to Mary Chang and claim to be Chinese, right?
Right, right,
Okay, just doesn't work for anybody with any common sense.
right. My
So
maiden name,
nor
by the way, is Riyadi, and my grandfather's last name is Musallam, so I have Arabic last name originally.
yes, yes. No, you can trace your roots there. but not to China. If you tried to tell me that you were Chinese, you had a right to return to China and own land and this, that, and the other, I'd be like,
Right,
what? Or if you converted to communism or Shintoism or Buddhism and claimed to be from a Far Eastern place, I would say,
right,
Mary, you probably need some therapy,
right, right. And that's how I feel about Zionism. I really do. I feel like I hate to use the word mental illness, but
Hmm.
almost like a brainwashing, I would even say. I mean, if you're taught something from a very early age, and I imagine this
Yes.
about Israelis, and so I do feel, even though how the kind of wickedness I have seen online, I still feel empathy for these people
Yeah.
because I think about it as, okay, they learned a lot about the Holocaust, right? That's been engraved
Yes.
in their minds since a very young age. But at the same time, like they're learning in school, the Arabs want to kill us. Everybody in the, all the Arabs want to kill us. They want to take us down. But it's like, why would you come to the Arab world then? If the
Hmm.
Holocaust happened and you were going somewhere to be safe, why would you surround yourself by Arabs that want to kill you? How does your
Hmm.
narrative make any sense? And I've
Yeah.
made this point to people before, and they're like, you have a good point. like,
Hmm.
it really doesn't. It really doesn't make sense. Why'd you surround yourself by Arabs that want to kill you? Because honestly, the Arab world, I think, was accepting of the Jews, and they had, there were educators, there were politicians, there were people who were Jewish within these Arab governments. And I don't think that's something that we discuss. Like they had political power within these governments as well, and they coexisted.
Yeah.
In 1950s, I believe it was, there was 1950 to 1951, I believe, I could be wrong with the year, but there were these Iraqi bombings that were happening. And so you got
Hmm.
to remember, this is like right after the creation of Israel, 1948. And so if you look this up, it will say that the perpetrators of the bombings, and they were bombing synagogues, by the way,
Hmm.
to scare the Jewish people because they were trying to get their Jewish population numbers up in Israel
Hmm.
so that they can maintain a Jewish state, right? I mean,
Yes,
just
I've
think
seen that.
about it.
Yes.
So I
Hmm.
think when they say, "Oh, the Arabs chased all the Jews out of their land," I don't know that that's the correct narrative. I think Israel had definitely a motive to want to do some false flag attacks to get people to leave and to come to their state. They needed
Hmm.
their population numbers up.
Yes. Yes.
Mhm.
In order to have an ethno-religious political Frankenstate,
Right.
masquerading as the mysterious group that just popped out of from the Bible, from the Old Testament,
Uh-huh.
Israel. It is nuts. It really is nuts.
It is.
And whereas Palestinians, there are people who can trace their ancestry back to that exact part of the world in the times of Jesus and before. And this is
It's so
let's
sad. Because when
it
you think about it, it's
really
like
is.
everyone else, we're being told that everyone else belongs on the land of Palestine except for the people who were there who have ancestral ties there. That's what
Yeah.
Palestinians are being told.
Yeah. And we talk about the brainwashing. Anyone who hasn't listened to my last podcast with Rich Siegel, who is a former Jewish Zionist and was, I think, the president of his Zionist youth group, you need to hear that because Rich brings this out in a way that Mary and I don't. And he's much more scathing, let's put it that way, than we are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So It's very interesting to listen to, but people are awakening. And Mary, there's been a lot of
Mhm.
young Jewish people on there.
Right.
And I'm not saying this because you don't know, because you don't, but for the audience, the Israel will sponsor these right of return tours for young people where they go there and then they brainwash them and show them just everything they want to show them, the smoke and
Right.
mirrors, like Kim Jong-un would if you visited North Korea. You're going to see what they want you to see.
Right.
But these young American Jews had decided to go on over to the West Bank to visit the Palestinians, and they learned much differently, that these people were not savages, that they were so loving and hospitable, and they dwelt together, Christians, Muslims, otherwise.
Yeah.
And it freaked them out. And they were like, we've been taught the wrong narrative. They told us not to cross over because these savages were going to brutalize us. And then we ended up being with some of the most precious people we've ever met and hearing their stories and seeing firsthand what was going on
Right.
with the apartheid situation. And it changed their minds.
Right. Because the intention of that group was to show them one narrative and one side. And when
Yeah.
they did that, yeah, I remember watching that. That had to be years ago.
Yeah, but these kids wised up. But yeah, I mean, you can
Mhm.
find these things, I think, still on YouTube. But yeah, these
Right.
things are real.
I mean, this
Yeah.
has been a deep conversation for us. I know I've been speaking out about this since 2016 when I filmed my documentary. And I know you've been speaking about this for years as well. And there's others
Mhm.
who have been following for decades.
Yeah.
But we've been, pushing out the truth of what's actually happening on the ground. And so, yeah, it's upsetting when, everything comes together, is kind of brought to October 7th, right? Instead of,
Yeah.
what's
Yeah.
what happened before that? What caused
The
the entire
entire story.
picture?
Let's
Mm,
get back to Theodore Herzl. Let's talk about Schofield, and let's
right.
let's 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 talk about all these things. And then you find out that it's a very tangled web that had little to do with religion in the minds of so many Zionists, and
Oh, yeah.
still doesn't.
Yeah, Herzl
Much
was
of
an
the
atheist.
population are professing atheists, but they believe God gave them the land, and that's a paraphrase from Israeli historian Elon
Yeah,
Pape, and it's
he
it's
said that.
it's wild.
It really
Yeah.
is. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable
Yes.
what's
Yes.
happening.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So moving along here. What is your take on recent cries of high ranking Israeli and American government officials and high profile Christian pastors who are calling on Israeli soldiers to, quote, destroy Amalek, or as Nikki Haley likes to say, finish them?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, Nikki Haley, she wrote on an Israeli missile, "Finish them." And then we have former President Trump saying in a recent presidential debate, "Let Israel finish the job." I
Mhm.
mean, they're playing obviously to a Christian Zionist base. They're part of a seven mountain mandate. And what that is many of our televangelists or popular pastors are part of this group. They believe that they should influence through media, movies, and government to promote what they believe is needed, a holy war that will hasten the second coming of Christ.
Mhm.
So I don't know if you're aware of the seven mountain mandate, if you ever read up on that.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
It's really interesting. There was a documentary recently that came out about, it's called 7M, and it was
Mhm.
about some dancers, TikTok dancers that were involved in this kind of cult, and they're called 7M, and the pastor called himself Israel, and he was doing all horrible things to these women, he raping them and whatnot. And
Mhm.
but there's some Zionist aspects to this because they're talking about apparently, the end of times, things like that, promoting that kind of end time war. So, Christian Zionism and the normalization of this belief, along with grouping objectors to their ideology as anti-Semitic, I think is part of their plan, right?
Yeah,
And it's going to it's going their way at this point. It would be an outful outcome, I think, for humanity to continue down this path, and I think it's already displaying that for itself to be that way.
yeah.
There's over 17,000 Palestinian children killed so far, and then Save the Children are reporting over 20,000 children are missing. So, I mean,
Mhm.
that brings our numbers up to 37,000 Palestinian children that have probably been killed at this point.
It's horrible.
Isn't that horrible? And
Beyond.
and it's really It's sickening because we're seeing like the videos and the images, children's without their limbs, without their heads, everything. And then you're
Hmm.
hearing, they're getting amputations without anesthesia, and nothing has stopped them. Nothing has been able to stop them. And I want to say, the numbers could be even higher than that, right? Because of the type of
Yeah.
bombs that are being used. I mean, Gaza is 25 miles long and I
Hmm.
think 7.5 miles wide at its most, widest point.
Yeah.
So that is small with over 2 million of a population. And then they're saying that 70,000 tons of bombs have been used on Gaza in 6 months, which was more than Dresden, Hamburg, and London combined during World War II. So we
Yeah.
know these figures aren't accurate, right? I don't know what you've heard, Joe, but I've heard around 200,000 most likely are actually killed.
That's what I've heard, and I
Right.
believe those are from people deeply associated with the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and who specialize in war crimes and forensics. And again, people in the know. There seems to be a consensus among those with integrity that the numbers are much higher. And why wouldn't they be? If you're killing journalists and there's no telling what's happening and who's under the rubble and everything that's going on, it's not like a video game where a life is taken and a number pops up. So I think you're right. And I do think that these experts are unfortunately correct.
Denial about the Palestinian death toll in the very beginning. And then remember, the Palestinian Authority, I think, released the documents of
Yeah.
everyone's name. Remember that early on
Hmm.
when they were able to keep track of the count. But I feel like everything is so dysfunctional now, and it's absolutely, crazy the type of bombing that's happening and killing
Yeah.
that's happening. They're not able to keep count of everyone.
Yeah.
But so the denial and questioning of Palestinian death toll was happening from the very beginning. Joe Biden questioned it. Do you remember
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I feel like these numbers have not went up for months now, and that 37,000 I think is where they've had the total count at for like months,
Hmm.
like around 37 to 40,000, and it's like that's how many children are probably killed, not
Hmm.
even the entire, population that have been killed yet. Like I don't
Yeah.
think they have their numbers right for sure.
Yeah.
So I
I saw an interview recently,
Mhm.
and this Israeli official was trying to act like they were just so victorious and they were just the greatest, and how they had killed, I think it was like 14,000 members of Hamas. And the
Lies.
interviewer asked him, saying, "Well, how many civilians were killed?"
Oh, Pierce Morgan? Was it
Yeah,
Pierce?
I think it was Piers Morgan, and they couldn't put a number on it. He said, "Well, how is it that you have all this precision and you got these precise numbers
Or
of
Hamas.
how many people Hamas that you've killed, but you can't tell me how many civilians you've killed?" And the guy was tongue tied. You could tell he was
Yep.
just lying through his teeth.
There's so many lies, so many
Yeah.
things, Joe, that we've seen, come out of the Israeli government. It's absolutely astounding. I mean, we see the influence of Zionism and what it has. I mean, if someone said what Trump had said, finish
Hmm.
them,
Yeah.
or wrote on a Palestinian rocket, to finish them,
Yeah.
finish
Yeah.
the job, whatever. Can you imagine if they said that and it was towards Jewish people or Israelis?
Yeah.
It's
Or imagine a Mexican writing it on a Mexican bomb, death to America, or whoever. If it was anybody else, or if these things were being aimed at, Scandinavia, a predominantly white population with blue eyes and blonde hair, people would be ripped.
right. And as far as like Netanyahu and others, they've continuously have used the verbiage such as Amalek, describing Palestinians.
Yeah.
It's very weird.
Yeah.
And they say, like, we're going to defeat Amalek. So, I had to look into the scripture because I wasn't really familiar with it, to be honest. And then I
Hmm.
realized, wow, if you believe this, then you potentially believe any non Jew should be killed. I
Hmm.
mean, it's a genocidal statement, absolutely. And it's coming out of the Israeli politicians and leaders' mouths.
Well,
A female even a female
yeah.
no, even a female politician early on stated the children of Gaza brought this upon themselves.
Hmm.
And many of their representatives have failed to differentiate between civilians and Hamas, for instance.
Yeah.
So they're inciting collective punishment. I mean, this has been documented by the United Nations.
Yeah. Yeah. And how are you to, again, you're going to bring these ancient people and make the correlation, make that wild jump and assumption that these people are descendants of Amalek or Philistines, and you're David. It's so much bull because again, we're talking about there was such a mixed multitude in that Israeli population of people from different ethnicities, and people could join, the religion, and and you also have, again, you got people who can trace their ancestry back to the land, and it doesn't mean, and they very well could have been, okay, first century Jews, even disciples of Jesus who were Jews. Okay.
Mhm.
Um, and,
Exactly.
and again, we could go on with so many other facts on this, historical and scientific. And there's no way that you can trace and say, oh, the Palestinians, they're Canaanites, they're Philistines, they're whatever, when you had so many different people who have lived in that land and live in that land from between the time of the Roman Empire, between between AD 70, let's say, and the present, with all of these empires that have been there in Palestine and people who were there. Let's say it's so much more convoluted than people think it is. It really is.
Right. Right, and they're using that Amalek everywhere. I'm like, "Oh my goodness, this is insane. This is insanity."
Yeah.
How can Christians support that? Like, I don't get it. But I think they're taught too in their churches or something that the Arabs are Amalek,
Yeah.
maybe. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't know.
That's like trying to separate who's a descendant of Isaac and who's a descendant of Ishmael. When you have people there, okay, if you have Jews who converted to Islam,
Right.
okay, who were descendants, let's just say, of Isaac for
They wouldn't
conversation's
give
sake,
Ishmael, they would
they
give Isaac.
no,
So
you don't. They didn't get a blood transfusion. You know, this is so. That's why it is so convoluted. And then you look at the father of the Abrahamic faiths. Okay, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He comes from Ur of the Chaldees, that we know is modern day Iraq.
Mhm.
Okay, so
Right.
like I say, the whole thing, comes out, and Jesus didn't come to divide. he,
He came to bring
he,
everyone
he,
together, and the fact that
he,
there is so much
yes,
division, and that should
showing
be an eye.
Father's original intention, and
Mhm.
that's for love, and it's universal, and it's not all of this bullying and hegemony and imperialism and racism and land grabbing, thieving, and sacrificing the teachings of Jesus on the altar of some crazy, messed up eschatology that's trying to get as many Jews as possible into the Holy Land so that Jesus can kill 2/3 of them, send them to eternal conscious torment, along with every other Jew from at least AD 30. All right, a lot that includes Holocaust victims, and send them to eternal conscious torment. In that understanding makes our God real. I mean, worse than Satan. It is
Right,
horrible. It is a demonic. It is doctrines of devils. Is what, quote, Christian Zionism is, and it needs to be exposed for what it is. And it's a fraud, theologically, historically, and scientifically. It's a fraud.
right. It is. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable
Wow.
what they believe, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Again, the finish them thing, Nikki Haley just riding on those bombs. That's cold blooded. And there
I
were
mean, if it
others.
was
I think Mike
reversed.
Pence, there are a bunch of others that
Right.
went over there really to lick Netanyahu's boots, and also trying to garner attention. And it's amazing that Nikki Haley wrote that. I believe that was just hours, just days, maybe 48 hours, whatever it was, 30 before Trump's verdict, okay, in
Mm.
New York, where he became an official convicted felon. So all of this, she's sucking up to them while this is happening. So this political maneuvering and kissing up to the Israeli lobby. You talk about election interference. Shut
Yes.
up about Russia. Nobody does it more
And
than Israel and the United States.
we were
Our
speaking
Congress
about
is
this
pretty
years
much
ago.
bought and paid for, and so is the presidency right now.
We were bringing attention to that years ago, though, like in our post on Facebook about AIPAC and the
Absolutely.
control that they had over our politicians.
Absolutely.
And even politicians have said it. You know, you had Cynthia McKinney and was it Jim Trafficant who
Hmm.
spoke openly about, the Israel lobby and their influence over Congress. And then it was anti-Semitic. It was smeared as anti-Semitic. I mean, this is what they do. Hmm.
It always is. That's like, if one of us commits a crime, and
Yeah.
somebody speaks out against our crime,
What do we?
nobody's going to claim, well, you're anti-Christian,
And that's my thing, Joe. Like, if let's say that's anti-Semitic, right?
Yeah.
What about massacring over 30 something thousand children?
Yeah.
What about saying finish them on a missile? What about saying let Israel finish the job? Is that
Yeah.
not anti-Semitic? And I think people don't understand what the word Semite means.
Thank you.
So if you want to explain that, Joe, you can explain that to the viewers. 'Cause,
Well, it's really people from basically the area of the Levant who speak certain languages, Hebrew and Arabic being those languages, and being able to, again, I go deeper than that because anybody can really learn a language. So I think it's bogus just because, again, I can learn to speak Swahili, but it
right.
doesn't make me Kenyan, So there's that there too. You look at the dictionary, it says languages, and I think it goes deeper than
Yeah, I
that.
think it's talking about the indigenous people, like the people
Yeah.
from the region. Yeah, originally from there that spoke
Yes. And
this.
again, that's just like the Nigerian can't become, Italian. He can't. And me speaking against the Nigerian doesn't
It's just
does not make me anti-Italian or anti-Catholic if he commits a crime because he converted to Roman Catholicism. It's
right.
just it's nuts. It's crazy. And again, it's all this. Like Stevie Wonder said, if you believe in things you don't understand, then you suffer. Superstition ain't the way. And and it isn't. But so many people have believed it, and Palestinians are suffering.
Right. Right.
Man. Okay, let me move on. Got a couple more questions. Okay. The post that's pinned to the top of my Facebook page says, imagine tracing your genealogy back to the first followers of Jesus and being told by Western Christians that you don't belong in the Holy Land because you're Palestinian and not Jewish. Please speak to that.
Yeah. Well, people have converted over time. Palestinian Christians living in the birthplace of Christ in Bethlehem, my family included, were most likely following Judaism at some point, if you trace back their ancestry far back enough. The same is true for Muslims of the region, because they could have converted from Judaism to Christianity to Islam. This happened, or even from Judaism to Islam. I mean, this happens. So we can't pretend that there were no conversions or intermarriage. What many Western Christians seem to believe is replacing the people of the land so that their
Mhm.
beliefs of God can rule, like a God who seems to value supremacy, war, vengeance, materialism, not Christ the peacemaker. That's what I
Yeah.
would say.
Yeah. Now, one of their biggest mantras back in 1948 and beyond was they claimed that Palestine was a land without people for a people without land. Speak to that.
There were people there. I mean, there were people there. I mean, it's what we spoke about earlier. There were people there, and I think that's horrible that we can deny the existence of Palestinians. It's like Holocaust denial. We would never accept that. Why is it acceptable when we're speaking about Palestinians to say things like
Yes.
finish them, to write on missiles, finish them, to say they don't exist as a people, they're a fake made up people, or to portray them in such an evil light? Why is it okay and acceptable to do that, and it wasn't acceptable to do that to Jews?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It doesn't make sense to me, but it does, because I feel like, like I said, the government, the media, the influences, um,
Yeah.
have really played into that.
Yeah. And how do you terrorize people who don't exist? And again, it pushes back against so many foolish arguments, I mean, if nobody's there, then what was the problem? It's just this barren desert, and you walked in and just miraculously turned it into just a blooming garden, I mean, just you have to be a blooming idiot, really, if you study history at all to believe that.
Right, right.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious as to why people so easily fall for that there were no people on the land. And I think that's what they believe. I think that's their narrative, is that there was nobody there and the Arab invaders came in and took over the land.
yeah,
But they don't talk about
it's
the 700,000 plus Palestinians who left and fled the land and were killed, and there was massacres like Deir Yassin and other massacres.
Yeah.
They don't talk about that in our history books. And I think people should question that. Why? Why aren't we taught about that? Is there a reason? Is there a motive?
But Mary, it's very convenient, especially if you can get a scoundrel like C.I. Schofield to write
Mhm.
commentary in a Bible,
Right.
and then you've brainwashed all of these seminary students in America, brainwashed multiple, I mean, many, many denominations and a large majority of Christian America, and the pastor who they trust, the theologian, is also bringing this fake historical narrative, and he's never studied that stuff. And I can tell you firsthand, they do not teach. They do not teach legitimate history. Okay,
Right.
in these seminaries, they don't. I was a product of that. Okay,
Uh-huh.
you're in the dark about that. But people, again, when that narrative is repeated and these falsehoods, and you are projecting this false history and this false theology and this false understanding over the biblical text, it perverts everything. But when people are just viewing everything through that paradigm and that worldview, is again, it is a mess. But the thing I love about right now is, Christian Zionism's expiration date has already passed. These
Right.
people, we understand in Matthew 24:34, Jesus said that all those things would come to pass in that generation. He wasn't prophesying of perpetual wars and rumors of wars and all that stuff. He was prophesying the destruction of old covenant Israel, okay? And the bringing in, the ushering in of a new day, okay, through him who is the consummate fulfillment of Israel. That's what Jesus was talking about there. And so it's astonishing when these people bring all of this other crazy doctrine into the conversation, and it's almost like Jesus never existed, and we just, we put everything on pause for over 2,000 years, and all of a sudden, this other group pops up. But the thing is, Jesus said, I'm getting back to that, in Matthew 24 verse 34, he said that all those things would come to pass in that generation. Now, a
Right.
biblical generation is understood to be 40 years, okay? So if you took him saying that in right around AD 32 or 33, most likely, depending on what calendar you go by. But if you look at that, this did happen in AD 70. So there you have your timeline. But people that look at Franken Israel and they don't believe the scripture and don't believe what Jesus said, okay, and there are even theologians who say Jesus got it wrong. They Those that believe that 1948 was some special day, a special time when Franken Israel was created. Look, 40 years already went by in 1988. They were writing books. There was a book written, "Why 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 1988."
Right.
Then there's the other biblical argument that a generation is 70 years. Well, guess what, Mary? You and I know this, and everybody ought to know this. It's been 76 plus years now. So again, the expiration date has happened. You can play scriptural gymnastics and pervert things and take a verse out of anywhere you want, but
Right.
this Zionist theology, it has expired. It's like I say, it never was. This never was that theory, that theology, that doctrine of demons. Okay, they set their own expiration date with it, and the expiration date has already happened. And sorry for taking up too much time,
No,
but
it's great.
people need to know that.
Yep,
People
they do.
need to know that this is a fantasy. This is not going to happen. That is not God's plan for planet Earth. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I do think people need to understand the misinterpretation of the biblical text
Mm-hmm.
and the way it's been interpreted, for sure.
Oh, it's crazy. And even the book of Revelation. And if you want to get it, I interviewed Dr. Cindy Coates not long ago. She just wrote a book on
Mhm.
Matthew 24 that outlines these things. And
Oh, wow.
so we discussed in particular Matthew 24:6. about people believing in perpetual wars and rumors of wars, and it affecting U.S. foreign policy in a horrible way, especially in the Middle East. So we had that discussion, and it's a good one. People really ought to listen in on that one as well. Okay, now, last question, I think. Okay. And you've been wonderful. You're just a wonderful sister, and I appreciate you so much.
Yeah,
But
thank
here
you.
we go. How do you feel when people frame the current genocide in Gaza and with this question and the ongoing atrocities on the West Bank too? Because there've been so many as I said, they've continued with their horror there, and where the news has all been in Gaza, they've been up to really evil things in the West Bank. So I want to include that as well.
Right.
What do you do when people frame these events, the genocide in Gaza and the terror that continues in the West Bank around the events of October 7th, 2023?
Yeah. I mean, it's devastating, you know. I'll explain why. Since 2016, after filming the documentary, I've been vocal through my social media platforms, speaking about the oppression that I witnessed firsthand and reports on the ground long before October 7th. So,
Mm.
you know,
Yeah.
prior to October 7th, there was so much happening. There's a video of an Israeli settler with his group actively confiscating a Palestinian home in East Jerusalem. He speaks openly about the Zionist project on camera. He says, "We take house to house and we'll make East Jerusalem like West Jerusalem, the capital of Israel." I mean, this is ethnic cleansing. And in order to understand that it's ethnic cleansing, you have to understand that in 1948, around 30,000 Palestinians who lived in West Jerusalem were ethnically cleansed from West Jerusalem. There's no Palestinians in West Jerusalem today. So
Mm-hmm.
many of the Palestinian population that were in West Jerusalem ended up in the West Bank or East Jerusalem. So making East Jerusalem like West Jerusalem is therefore ethnic cleansing. I mean, and the thing is that people don't understand as well is that Arabs make up 61% of the population in East Jerusalem today. They are the majority, yet
Mm-hmm.
Palestinians in the West Bank need a permit that is often denied to enter that area. So this is a clear description of apartheid. So
Yes.
that's one circumstance. You also have worshipers at the Al Aqsa Mosque who were being
Mm-hmm.
violated by the IDF on multiple occasions throughout the years. I've posted videos of this. It's all on camera to see. I mean, the IDF used stun grenades inside the mosque, the rifle butts to beat Palestinian worshipers, to include
Mm.
elderly. I mean, imagine if this were a synagogue or a church,
Oh, mercy.
you know?
Yeah.
And then we have
People go ballistic. Yeah.
Right, right, they would. And then you have Shireen Abu Akla, a Palestinian Christian with American citizenship, who was an Al Jazeera journalist, and she was targeted and killed by the IDF in May of 2022. But the news media initially lied and said Palestinian resistance fighters had killed her. This was the
Mm-hmm.
initial narrative that was put out to our media. And the Israelis even put out a propaganda video claiming it proved it, that they had killed her. But finally, when the kind of news started to die down, that's when the Israelis admit through their own sources, the Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post,
Mm-hmm.
that one of their soldiers killed her, most likely
Yeah.
killed her, but also stated that no one would face charges.
Yeah.
And then during her funeral in East Jerusalem, the Israeli police beat the pallbearers carrying her casket, which was almost
Mhm.
dropped. And it was recorded on Al Jazeera Live for all to see.
Yes.
But we
It's
didn't,
on YouTube too. There is
right,
video evidence of this. Yes.
right, but we didn't see that portrayed in the American media. We didn't see this spoken about in the American media, right?
No. No. No.
And then you had during the Great March of Return, the protests that took place between 2018 to 2019 in Gaza. And the
Hmm.
IDF were shooting and killing Palestinians behind the separation fence. They
Yeah.
targeted children, people praying, a double amputee in a wheelchair was killed, people who posed no threat were maimed. But the
Yeah.
Israeli settlers, I remember this image too. The Israeli settlers came to watch and cheer it on. If it's so
Hmm.
dangerous, why are you right there by the fence cheering your soldiers killing civilians behind the fence?
Yeah.
And again, this is on video. There's news stories, video images for anyone to see.
Yeah.
You know,
Speaking of by the fence, and I'm not trying to cut you off, but I think this is important. Okay.
uh-huh,
Let's talk about by the fence, because this is supposed to be, and it is,
it's a
one of the
buffer
most
zone.
secure borders on earth, okay?
Right.
Like North Korea. All right, this is and they boast about this being the most secure border on earth. And we talk about the gates. This is the gates to the world's largest open air concentration camp, been called that by Israeli historians as well,
Right.
and is Israeli media. So why would you have, okay, a Lollapalooza style music concert scheduled, set for another venue, and then move it right near the gates that all of a sudden become insecure? And then you have Hamas, then you have these people like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the oppressed, seeing this opening, okay, and coming through it. To me, this was premeditated by the Israelis. They knew that they were going to end up killing their own people, as well as starting this. It was all a plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza and all Palestinians from the land. In my view, would you speak to that?
Yeah, so I will speak to that. I mean, it came out weeks I think we all were talking about the Hannibal Directive, maybe like a week after the incident happened, after October 7th.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because we're some conspiracy theorists, it's because we were getting news from alternative news sources like the Gray Zone and people who could be objective that we've seen come out with the truth before, the
Mm-hmm.
mainstream media does. So, we go there, we're seeing these stories, and I think it was Yasmin Parat, an Israeli who was in Kibbutz Be'eri, that was by the UN, the United Nations has stated that at least 14 civilians were killed by Israel's own fire. And she
Mm-hmm.
admitted that, we were held hostage with the Hamas militants there. And then it was the Israeli tanks that were firing at us.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there was, and so speaking to the Hannibal Directive, it's basically where Israel believes that it's better to kill their own militants, their own military, than for them to be taken hostage by Hamas or some other adversary group. So they kill them instead. Well, apparently, according to the UN, they were also using that technique on civilians. So we don't even know that the majority of the killings on October 7th were done by Hamas. And I will say this, Hamas does not have an air force.
No,
They do not have Apache helicopters. They do not have tanks.
no.
So, and bodies were burned severely bad. It was said that, I don't remember who it was, Joe, but Mehdi Hassan interviewed someone. I think he was like some ambassador or something. He's definitely working for Israel. And he was interviewed about the death toll. And they brought down the death toll from like 1,400 to 1,200. And they said, well, why did you bring down this death toll? And he says, well, we realized that, the bodies were so badly burnt, we didn't recognize that some of these were Hamas terrorists. So that
Yeah.
means that 200 of those who were badly burned were Hamas terrorists. Well, how did you burn the bodies that bad? And that's what they keep showing is these burned kibbutz, the burned cars and vehicles and bodies. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry, but that was most likely done by Israel itself. And even the
Yeah.
United Nations is kind of hinting towards that at this point. And there have been others speaking on that on Pierce Morgan. Who is it? George Galloway? He was on Pierce
Mm-hmm.
Morgan recently, brought up the Hannibal Directive.
Yeah.
So now people are starting to speak to it. So I will
Yeah.
say, and they did know about it. Egypt warned Israel about some plan that Hamas had, and then Business Insider reported recently Israeli military knew how Hamas planned to take hostages weeks before October 7th, which honestly, Joe, I find so bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
According to IDF intelligence officials, this is what it says. Even predicted Hamas to take 200 to 250 hostages. I find it so bizarre, honestly,
Mm-hmm.
that they knew all this information beforehand and they didn't react.
Yeah.
And it's not, and the thing is, if people are forgetting that in November we had a hostage exchange deal going on. Palestinian hostages who were held in prison without charge or trial, which I consider to be hostages, some of them children, were held without charge or trial, were being swapped out for those who are Hamas hostages, right? So we
Yeah.
had that happening and taking place, and then it stopped. I don't think it stopped because of Palestine. It stopped because Netanyahu and his group had a goal to take over Gaza. They've always wanted to ethnically cleanse the land, take over the land, confiscate the land. So this isn't a secret to anyone who's
Yeah.
been paying attention, right? So I think
Yeah.
they definitely use this situation to further their goals and their agenda at the Greater Israel Project.
The lies that were perpetuated by our president about beheaded babies and the systemic rape of women. Hmm.
But it was made to sound as if like it was a second Holocaust. I think they even used that terminology.
It's nuts.
Right. It's such a double standard and
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense. And I know what
Hmm.
Israel's about and I know their techniques that they've used in the past. Like I said, there's been false flag attacks, you and I both know, where they dressed up like Arabs. The King David hotel bombing, they admitted to dressing up like Arabs to try to make it look like Arabs did it. But then it's
Hmm.
very well known the Yergon, who was a terrorist gang, Zionist gang, committed that attack, right?
Hmm.
You also have U.S.S. Liberty, where they tried to sink the ship. They were going to blame Egypt. They're always going to blame somebody else, but they do false flag attacks. Lavon
Yeah.
Affair, that was
Yep.
done by Israeli agents, Arab Jews. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was either a second operation going on or something. Definitely they knew
Yes.
this was going to happen and saw it as a benefit to them.
Well, that sounds a lot like 9/11 because it was on Fox News. There are 5 Mossad agents on the top of a building filming the planes hitting the Twin Towers,
Right.
okay? Yeah,
Celebrating.
2 plane yeah, yeah, and celebrating, and they were there. Yeah, I mean, so at the least, they had foreknowledge of it. You don't just show up on top of a building to film something you know nothing about. So Israel is really complicit by not letting your best buddy, America, know that they are about to get bombed at the least, in my mind. That's where they are. Such a scumbag move. That is not something you do to your friends. You warn your friends. You don't film it happening. And if you did film it happening, and you sent people all the way over here to be on a building with cameras and they're dancing when it's happening, then you had foreknowledge and malice and a
Right.
reason for it to happen. And there's tape of Netanyahu talking about it, it's really prophesying about it. About you can find it
Yeah, I've
on
seen that
YouTube.
video.
Him alluding to the Twin Towers coming down by planes hitting them,
Mm,
and he also said that it was a great benefit. 9/11 was of great benefit, and what happened subsequently in Iraq was of great benefit. And you know that we got
Israel.
our quote intelligence from Israel to go after Saddam for weapons of mass destruction that he did not have. So
Right.
this is when you look at the tangled web, okay, it sounds so like conspiracy theory, weirdo, wacko. But when you look at their modus operandi throughout their entire terrorist history, you can't put anything past them. And you really need to do your research. And again,
Right.
I would start with Elon Pape, who is yeah, if anyone has skin in the game for the Israelis, it's him. He's
Yeah.
a Jewish Israeli historian who wrote the truth and speaks the truth about this, and there are others.
Right.
So again, it's important. Educate yourself. There's no excuse right now
Not
because
to.
there's the information is out there, and if you're not just going to be a bigot, okay, who's scared of hijabs and Arabic and Arabic sounding names and stuff, go watch Al Jazeera English live on YouTube. It's free. Go ahead, watch. Like I say, the footage does not lie. You're going to see things that are happening over there. There are reports of things that are happening. And what this is not just Arabs saying this, these are precious Europeans, precious South Africans, people,
Right.
Doctors Without Borders, people that just want to literally feed the hungry and clothe the naked and help people, humanitarian aid groups who do not have an axe to grind with anybody. If it were one, I used to say whatever, but these are multiple accounts speaking the exact same thing.
Right.
All of these doctors and even speaking, about all the Hamas tunnels under the hospitals, they're saying that's so much bull. So
Right.
again, if you're looking for
Which,
evidence
by the
to
way, Joe,
go ahead.
um, who was it? Ehud Barak was on a program and he said that the tunnels were built by Israel when they were occupying the territory, which
Hmm.
I have seen no one mention. They're always like Hamas tunnels, Hamas tunnels. I'm like, they were built by Israel. Like literally,
Yeah,
Ehud Barak was a former president or prime minister of Israel, said it.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I just wanted to bring up too, because 9/11, the conspiracy theorists surrounding that, a lot of people get put off by that, don't want to listen anymore.
Hmm.
But the Zionist connections are there. Even
Hmm.
Candace Owens, which I don't agree with Candace Owens often, has been putting this information together lately on her podcast. So, I mean, for instance, I can bring up a few things actually. How about the anthrax attacks that happened following 9/11? A week following the 9/11 they started, and they went to like the senator's office,
Hmm.
right? And they said debt to America, debt to Israel, Allah is great on these letters.
Hmm.
That's obviously made to frame Muslims, right?
Yes.
Right after
Yes.
the attack. However, it was Bruce Edwards Ivins who the FBI was looking into, and he killed himself before being formally charged. And he was a biodefense expert working for the United States Army. I mean,
Hmm.
when you start putting things together, like why did the letter say Israel? Insert Israel in there. And then
Yeah.
you find out he's actually Bruce Edward Ivins was a Zionist Christian, by the way, at the same time. So it's
Yeah.
like, could he have been working for Israeli intelligence? I don't know. And then you have, like you said, how about General Wesley Clark, where in a 2007 interview, he says, weeks after 9/11, he's a four-star Army general, by the way, United
Hmm.
States Army general. And he's saying that weeks after 9/11, he was told that the American government had a goal and objective to go after 7 countries in 5 years. And he names those countries: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. Sounds like a
Hmm.
plan of a greater Israel to me. And
Yeah.
like you had said, Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals, according to their narrative. None
Yeah.
were from Afghanistan or Iraq. So what
Yeah.
was the point in that? Like when you start
Yes.
questioning these things and start really looking into it and digging up information, even after
Hmm.
9/11, who was in our face all the time? Ehud Barak, Benjamin Netanyahu. They
Yeah.
were the ones selling us the narrative of the war on terror.
Now, for those listeners who don't understand the
Mhm.
greater Israel, when you're talking about that, could you explain that?
Yeah, so there was a plan back in the 80s, I think it was. It's called the Yin Yan plan, YINON, and you can look this up. And the plan was to create sectarian strife and division between the Arabs within these countries like Iraq, and to break them up so that Israel could eventually expand and take over parts of Iraq, Syria,
Mhm.
Lebanon. So when you think of all of our wars and you start to really put it all together,
Yeah.
it looks like, this is for the greater Israel project. And then also, times of Israel. People don't like dig in and read Israeli sources, but sometimes they tell on themselves.
Mhm.
A former defense minister mentioned in Times of Israel admitted that ISIS apologized to them in the Syrian Golan Heights during
Mhm.
the whole war with Syria. Why would ISIS, you guys, Islamic State, why would they apologize to Israel? I thought that they wanted to annihilate the Jewish state. I mean, this is what we were told after 9/11. These radical groups want to annihilate the Jewish state and we have to protect them.
Why has ISIS never attacked Israel?
Yeah, or Al Qaeda, for the matter
Yeah,
of fact.
exactly.
And that's the thing. And they apologized the one time where there were clashes. Like, so, and then look at what just happened in Russia. Didn't ISIS just attack Russia recently? Like,
Mhm.
it's interesting how they're always attacking American enemies.
Yeah.
And
Well,
honestly,
because this greater Israel thing we're talking about, people think that biblically, and you can look biblically at different borders or whatever, they think that certain, yeah, other portions, large portions, if not all of other Middle Eastern countries belong to them as well. And
yes,
I believe that includes like
Iran,
into Lebanon, Syria, yes, yes,
Iran.
and parts of Saudi Arabia, I believe parts of Egypt, just about everybody surrounding them kind of is on their turf and it belongs to them because God gave it to to many European atheist converts to Judaism.
Mhm.
It makes no sense.
It
Makes no
really,
sense.
it really doesn't. Like,
It's like the Nigerian becoming Italian, and he has the Greater Europe project, and he wants Portugal and France and Germany and Greece, and he just wants a piece of everything. He wants his tentacles and everything. It's nuts.
but what's interesting is, while promoting a colonial project that is about displacing people, people here
Mhm.
complain about immigration. They complain about refugees. But what do you think this project is creating? It's creating more refugees, more instability throughout the region, and even in the United States. So it's
Yes.
quite interesting, the people who support war and perpetual war, like, and don't see that this is also affecting American politics. It's almost
Yeah.
like they think it's disconnected from us, and it's not. It's all connected.
No. Yes.
Hmm.
Yes. Yeah, and it is affecting our status in the world. It's going to affect the value of the dollar when you have these BRICS nations right now, and America and Israel have become more and more a pariah, and for good reason. you know, in the world because of this genocide. And so there's a lot of, there's a lot of metanoia, repentance, mind change to be had. And I do have a lot of faith in what I believe the Lord is working. Our loving God is working in the younger generation because so many of them are having none of it. And the student encampments and all
Right.
of this really point to that. And the more youth I speak to, the more encouraged I am, Mary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I see it too. And
Yeah.
it's a shame our media's framing this in a backwards way of, oh, anti-Semitism on campus. But I mean, it's expected at this
Yeah.
point.
Well, it is. And who, when you look at, who runs the media, look at the corporations that own, that own the media. Used to be, I think, like 80 or 90 different ones, but now it's about, I think it's down to 5 or 6. And, I'll say much of it is Zionist controlled, at least the
Right.
mainstream. And so that's what you've got. You have that narrative, and that's what's been spewed. That's
And
what
then
the
that
American public has heard. That's what's been in the history books, in church, and again, it's been falsehood. And so don't talk about North Korea and the brainwashing when, like I say, believing that that Frank and Israel created in 1948 has any connection or is to God's plan, and we don't need Jesus. You don't make fun of North Koreans or say that they're brainwashed for thinking Kim Jong Un is God, because you pretty much think Israel is God and you worship Netanyahu and you got your own cult going on. So please leave the compound, people. Get out of those Christian Zionist churches. Do your research, stop the hatred, stop the bigotry, stop the warmongering, and let's follow the Prince of Peace for real.
right. I
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah.
Going
The,
back to the Great Return March and that protest that took place in 2018 and 2019, the
yeah.
one thing the media, like you said, the media does not present was completely overlooked was a wider discussion of why were they protesting. We didn't hear
Yeah.
anything about it. Like why are they protesting? They're just these fanatics coming near the border fence to
Hmm.
do what? You know, they were protesting an ongoing military occupation and the blockade of goods coming in and out of Gaza that are controlled by
Yeah.
Israel. The contaminated water system that at the time, according to the World Health Organization, was not safe for human consumption, and the
Hmm.
overall dire economic situation.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when they present Palestinians and their side of the narrative, it's
Yeah.
not it's not our side of the narrative. It's their side of the
Yeah.
narrative. I hardly hear what Palestinians have to say or what they think about a
Yeah.
situation. It's people talking about Palestinians versus
Yeah.
hearing from them themselves.
And it was a protest march. They were not returning.
Oh,
They were behind, I mean,
that
piles of
oh,
tires burning so they'd
right,
have cover from the snipers and whatnot. And so this was not an invasion. When you hear this great march of return,
right,
this was a protest.
right. And
Yeah.
and the
So
thing
that
is 70% of the Palestinians in Gaza are from areas of what's Israel today. So
yes,
that's something to
yes,
consider too. They're not from Gaza, many of them. They're from other
no,
areas they were ethnically cleansed from and placed
yes,
there. So
yes.
I don't know. The freedom of movement and restricted, it's restricted for Palestinians, even in the West Bank. You mentioned the West Bank earlier. So, I mean,
Hmm.
people don't really understand the situation there. So I guess I can just explain that, what I witnessed. There's checkpoints in between Palestinian cities, like getting from Bethlehem to Ramallah is a process. And those are two Palestinian cities, they're not Israeli cities. And the reason why is because there's illegal settlements in between these cities. And
Hmm.
so Palestinians have to endure these checkpoints while these settlers do not. They have separate roads for them and they can easily access Israel without
Hmm.
checkpoints. Israeli children are not subjected to martial law and imprisonment without charge or trial, as the Palestinian children are in the West Bank.
Hmm.
And the abuses amounting to torture in some circumstances are happening within the military detention system. It's well documented by even Israeli human rights organization like Bethlehem.
Yeah.
So, there's no doubt in my mind Americans who value freedom would never accept the lifestyle of a Palestinian and would respond to this oppression with violence, absolute violence. I believe it.
Hmm.
But if you would not accept what I have mentioned for yourself and your family, why is it okay to accept this for someone else and theirs? What should the Palestinians do after 75 years of oppression, perpetual violence, occupation, and confiscation of their land, the theft of their human dignity and freedom? Because at this point, it seems the influences in control believe the solution is for Palestinians to lay down and die for Zionism, and for us to allow Israel to finish the job.
Mm,
Yeah. So
yes.
all of this was happening prior to October 7th. And so the question for your listeners that I have is, if this information is new to you, ask yourself, why are you only finding out about it now? Why didn't you know?
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Very good question. That's
Yeah.
great.
Why didn't you know? Why are you just finding out now? You know?
Yes. Yes.
And that's what I did,
Mary.
Joe. That's what I did. That's what I did when I started my documentary and I started digging for information. I did that because I didn't know. I didn't know. And so
Mhm.
I dug for this information. It didn't just
Yeah.
come to me.
Well, I appreciate all that you've done. Would you tell us again the name of your documentary? And we'll put a link in the description. But if you would just let us know the name of it again and where we can access it.
Right. So it's Christians of Palestine, Life Behind the Wall. It is a short documentary film under 30 minutes. You can find the documentary trailer on YouTube. The actual documentary is on Amazon Prime and it's available for rent.
Wonderful, and I highly recommend it. I've seen it, and
Mhm.
it's wonderful. And you need to see these loving, precious people telling their stories. And I'll tell you, and there's no hate in them either. They're so, I mean,
Mhm.
it's amazing just how truly Christian these Palestinian Christians are. I
Yeah.
tell you what, it's amazing. It's amazing. Even if most people in the West don't even know they exist, they do exist, and they're precious. And we need to, why wouldn't I want to learn from someone who can trace their genealogy, you know, back to the original disciples of Jesus himself, Of course you would want to. And we need to. And
Yeah.
yeah.
These
So
Christians, Joe, I will say, they have more peace in their heart under occupation and forgiveness than I think I do, witnessing what I witness,
well, you know,
researching what I research. You know what I mean?
yeah.
I always strive.
I'm way more cantankerous than like Munter Isaac and different ones. I mean, just study, look. You can Google Bethlehem Bible College. Go on YouTube. Follow them on Facebook. Jonathan Katab, the Friends of Sabil North America. There are these various organizations, these Christians, the Christ at the Checkpoint conferences, where Munter and others are just so gracious with their guests. And it's amazing. You will be able to see their perspective and study Palestinian liberation theology. I'm going to be putting more reference books where you can study that on my website, the internationalpeacenetwork.org. And I just want to make more and more resources and put Mary's film on there as well. So anything, we're going to wrap it up, but anything that you'd like to say in closing, my dear sister?
No, I think I said what I needed to say. I just hope that everybody will go out there and research. And, I think a good start is probably to watch the documentary because if anything, it might bring up some information that you weren't aware of. And I think that's where I kind of started from and started to dig deeper
Hmm.
there. So I just hope for people to, listen and to research, honestly, see what they find
Yes.
and figure out. Peace and love to everyone.
It would be fun to have a group Zoom meeting with anyone who did watch the documentary and wanted to discuss, had any questions or anything like that,
That
or
really
just
would
had
be.
never met Palestinian Christians. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's a great idea, and,
Yeah,
possibly, bringing on my family. Some of the people in which I interviewed were my family,
yeah,
so members,
yeah.
so
So if you have questions, submit them, and yeah, we would love to get in touch with you and to be able to facilitate things like this where we can learn from each other and each other's experiences and have that. Because when it just deepens your empathy and your prayer and your compassion and all of that wonderful Jesus stuff that we Christians believe in or ought to. So thanks again, Mary. I appreciate you, sister.
thank you, Joe.
You have a great evening.
You too.
All right. Thanks so much for tuning in to that wonderful interview with our precious sister Mary Davis. And remember, world peace is not only possible, it's inevitable.